Chapter 7 discusses interest groups and business corporations, and those are part of the linkage institutions between we the people and the elected officials who make decisions on our behalf. And so we're going to talk about what constitutes an interest group and how they attempt to affect the different government officials. And so we're going to start actually with a definition, and it's actually a definition that's pretty straightforward. And then we want to move on and talk more specifically about a definition that was given to us by James Madison in Federalist Number 10, which I had you read for this section of the course. It's one of the famous Federalist papers, and the discussion about interest groups, or what he calls factions, is one of the most famous parts of the Federalist Papers, so it's worth struggling with it, even though it's 18th century American prose. It can be somewhat difficult at times. The underlying idea is actually one that's worth hearing, and particularly we're going to be going over the argument that he puts forward and what we should think about factions, because, not to give too much away, but the factions are both good simultaneously, and we need to think about that and how do we deal with the fact that there are some negative aspects of interest groups, but at the same time, some of the foundational reasons we have interest groups are actually really quite positive. So before we get to that more formal discussion, let's start with a basic definition using a rule we should never do. When you give a definition, you use the same terms to define the term that you're trying to define, but at the end of the day, it's actually pretty helpful. If you think about what an interest group is, an individual who share a common interest. I mean, that full stop is what an interest group is. By its name, it tells you what it is. And it's a recognition that even though there was a view about human nature that led the framers of the U.S. Constitution to have to restrict both the voters, and also there's a recognition that in many ways, we work together. We're social creatures, and that we recognize as individuals that sometimes our voice is stronger if we work with others who share a common viewpoint, that we can work together and try to influence government policy and things like that. Or we can just hang out with people because they share our interests and we like what they're doing and we share a common interest. So in many ways, interest groups are a fundamental sense of society. And so they're part of what our system is, and we need to take into account the fact that people aren't just going to act individualistically. They're not just going to vote. There are going to be other ways in which, as a group, they might try to influence policy and talk about things. So the definition of an interest group can start with that basic definition. It's a group of people who share a common interest. The examples of them I give you on the slide is to talk about that there are a whole range of them. You have the Sierra Club, you have the World Wildlife Federation, you have Greenpeace, and those are all ones that are dealing with aspects of environment and concerns about the environment. But you can see that even within that, there's some range. So the World Wildlife Federation tends to be one that is trying to get a broad base of support. They're not very controversial in the sort of policies that they're advocating, the techniques that they use. On the other hand, Greenpeace is one that at times people will go on small rafts and try to stop whaling ships from killing whales out in the open ocean. And so Greenpeace is much in terms of the techniques that it uses. And because of that, Greenpeace tends to be a smaller group than World Wildlife Federation, which has the panda or some other animals and on bags and things that people buy. And so there's a whole range that even within one interest area, there are different kinds of interest groups that you could join, and different people join for different reasons. The AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons, is one I don't bring up simply because I'm a member of it, and I know you're shocked because I'm way too young. But the American Association of Retired Persons is one of the more powerful interest groups we have in our society because it is made up of old people. The name's not that surprising. You can join when you're 50. That's why I'm able to do it. I just turned 50. And I can now be a card-carrying member of the American Association of Retired Persons. But the reason why the AARP is so effective is that, as we'll talk about when we talk about political participation next week, we will point out, and some of you have already done this in your papers, is to recognize that some people participate more than others. And old people generally have much better voter turnout than younger people. And therefore, if you have a group of people who are upset, and there are a group of voters who are upset, and you know that a large number of them will vote, then in fact they might have more of an impact than a group of younger people who get together and say they're upset about something. So the American Association of Retired Persons is a very powerful lobbying group, a very powerful interest group. The National Rifle Association is another one, and we'll be talking about that in a case study that we do in the final, the third lecture that we have the third PowerPoint that we have is really a linkage to a couple of videos talking about the role of the NRA in the debate about gun control and gun violence. They are successful in a different way. Do not have a huge membership. It's about maybe 3 or 4 million people who are card-carrying members of the National Rifle Association. It is also made up of gun companies that sell guns, manufacture guns, but also the ammunition. And so the NRA talks about that they are ones that talking about individual rights to bear arms, but there are also the corporations that would benefit from a certain policy in terms of the type of gun rights and things like that. The National Rifle Association is particularly strong because they have strong passion, and the people who join that and believe very strongly in the Second Amendment rights are individuals who vote. They are ones who vote even in the primaries, and so if they are told by the National Rifle Association that their current legislator is one that has voted against the interests of and have in the past, go after that incumbent and put in during the primary someone else who's of the same political party, usually try to get out of office someone who's dared to cross the National Rifle Association by talking about things like maybe have a background check or something like that. The American Medical Association, the American Dental Association, those are groups that represent professionals, and sometimes they have expertise because of their professional nature. They're also ones that are fairly wealthy, and so their interests are ones in terms of policies that matter, certainly for public health, but also what that is going to mean for the bottom line for doctors and for dentists. The California Faculty Association, the Service Employees International, unions used to be very powerful in our society. They are less powerful than they used to, but they certainly have some important role to play. The nurses union here in California has actually been very, very successful in getting the California government to listen to their demands because they are often taking the position of being caregivers and pointing out the weaknesses in our health system. And that they're willing to go on picket lines and things like that. But also, the list includes Walmart, ExxonMobil, and corporations. So corporations are also included. They do have interests. And as we saw in the Citizens United ruling, the Citizens United mission of 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court argued that corporations do have freedom of speech rights. And they are certainly using that in terms of having independent expenditures in favor of and against certain politicians, but they will also try to influence policy beyond the election, that they'll try to get legislators to pass legislation a particular way or block legislation. They'll try to go after the executive branch and the bureaucracy and things like that. So those corporations are actually very important in terms of trying to. The top sectors of lobbying and of the U.S. government in 2018, you can take a look at just the list of those, what interests are ones that spend the most money trying to lobby and try to influence the policymakers. Health spent $565 million just in 2018. The sector of finance and insurance was $536 million. Communication with electronics is $424 million. Energy, $326 million. And then those dealing with the single issue NRA was $147 million. So there's a wide range of different groups that are out there that are trying to spend some real money to influence legislation. And if successful, sometimes they can reap benefits that are even greater than the millions that are being spent in terms of lobbying and trying to influence them. This is also true at the state level. We have a federal system, as you all know, and that is that we see lobbyists in the state of California. They spent $339 million lobbying California government in just 2017. So a considerable amount of money is spent at the national level, but also at the state level, particularly in large states like California or Texas or New York or Illinois, where there are a lot of people and a lot of those policies can influence not simply the state, but also the entire country. Because if California adopts a particular standard, then it might be true for the entire country, because they're not going to build separate cars for the United States. They're not going to have special cars built just for California. So once they reach the higher emission standards that have been imposed by California, then even if they're going to be sold in Oklahoma or Texas or something like that, that those cars will have the higher emission standards. So you can see why there's a lot of activity even at the state level in terms of lobbying. And so what we want to move on to next, and we'll actually do it so you can go back and take a look at it and to think about it, is the argument, the specific argument that was put forward in Federalist Number 10. What did they think interest groups were? And they also observe the potential problems with interest groups and how do you attempt to solve those problems. So that's what we're going to do in the next part.